You know, I'm a little disappointed with my players from the most recent session of Pathfinder that I ran. We had a shopping episode, and my players just spent all of their gold like it was going out of style. They basically wasted everything that they had, and they acted like they needed to spend every single gold piece before the session was over. In fact, the only member of the party who barely spent any money at all was the party rogue. Wait a minute. Let me see that character sheet. Today, let's talk about shopping in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller and do I have a deal for you. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we return to Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e, a series where we talk about the tips, tricks, and advice that Paizo offers storytellers to help us be more successful at the gaming table. Today, we're continuing our discussion of Downtime Mode in Pathfinder 2e by looking at the subject of shopping, of buying and selling equipment in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Last week we talked about earning an income and all of the different nuances of the rules that surround earning an income, but what is the point of earning a paycheck if you're not going to spend that paycheck? So today, we're going to talk about shopping. Now, this series is intended for storytellers of all skill levels from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2e isn't your preferred game, I still invite you to stick around and be a part of the conversation, because over the years I have seen that when you study a variety of different RPGs, you come up with great ideas that you can bring back to your favorite game. So, regardless of how long you've been playing or what you play, I hope that this conversation is helpful to you. As with all of the videos in this series, I do like to give you some references so that if you would like to study this topic a little more in depth, you have some places you can go and read up on it. Now, there is not a lot of information in the core rulebook or the Game Mastery Guide for buying and selling, for going shopping. You can find some information on buying and selling on pages 24 and 132 of the Game Mastery Guide. Page 24 of the GMG covers some of the default assumptions that you might run with in buying and selling inside of a game, and then page 132 is a discussion of marketplaces when you are building out settlements inside of your game, so those are both resources that you can look up. However, probably the best resource that Paizo has given storytellers who really want to up their shopping game is the book Lost Omens Grand Bazaar. This is a setting book from the Lost Omens line for Pathfinder 2e, and it covers, well, the Grand Bazaar, a very famous and sizable shopping center located in Absalom in the Galarian setting. This book actually gives you samples of a variety of different shops that you can include, offering you details on the shops, the shopkeepers, and even some small story hooks that might be tied to the different places that your players might go and try to expand their inventory. Now, even though this is a book that is set in a specific location inside of Galarian, honestly the structure of this book is very usable for any storyteller as a sort of inspiration for different shops, shopkeeps, that kind of thing. If you really want to see the creative flair that you can use when you're trying to expand upon the idea of shopping, this is a great resource and goes well beyond the basics that are found in the Game Mastery Guide. Now, I don't plan to cover any of the specific shops or shopkeeps from the Grand Bazaar in this video, but I do strongly recommend that as a resource if you really want to take the creative side of this conversation and run with it as far as you can. But for this video, we're going to cover mostly the basics of buying and selling and what that means from a story perspective. But before we do all of that, please help me to continue to invest in this channel by doing all of that cool YouTube stuff. If you enjoy this video, please like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to be a part of the Disaster Tour Guide community, you can check out my free Discord or my Patreon, both of which are linked in the video description below. Alright, let's get started. So the big question for today's video is really this: how do you as a storyteller want to handle the issue of shopping inside of your game? Because to be honest, you can actually approach this question a few different ways, and there are probably going to be situations where you will vary your answer to this question based on the needs of your game and the circumstances inside of your game. But let's start with a baseline. Here is a simple assumption that I think seems to be the rough default that is expected with Pathfinder 2e. A character can buy any common item for the listed price as long as that item's level is lower than their level and the level of the settlement that they are shopping in, without requiring any kind of special effort. By the same token, a character can sell any item that they possess for 50% of that listed cost, again with the same rough constraints. If a character wants to purchase an item above the level of the settlement that they are in, assuming that they are high enough level to qualify for that item, they can attempt to arrange for special purchases by putting in a special order or asking for someone to craft the particular item that they're looking for. But if the character wants an item above the level of the settlement that they are in, there will be some extra steps involved. If a character would like to purchase an uncommon item, it will typically follow the same guidelines as a common item, but typically with an additional surcharge of some kind, possibly increasing the price of the item by 10 to 20%. However, if the Game Master determines that a particular settlement is more likely to have an uncommon item, they can waive that surcharge and allow the item to be purchased at its normal value instead. Rare or unique items, or anything with an item level significantly above the level of the settlement that the PC occupies, will typically be completely unavailable and will typically only be accessible through alternative rules such as crafting. Those guidelines seem to be the rough default that Pathfinder assumes in approaching the design of the game. Though to be fair, you kind of have to read between the lines to catch that, and they do present the issue of buying and selling in a variety of different ways. So let's step back for a moment and establish a sort of scale for how a Game Master might manage buying and selling. Now, if you couldn't tell from the reference materials that I mentioned earlier, Paizo doesn't give us a lot of very hard, specific rules on buying and selling, and instead in the Game Mastery Guide, they present the idea of shopping and buying and selling and that aspect of the game more as a sliding scale that a Game Master can adjust to the needs of their story. When you deal in a sliding scale, that conversation can get very vague very quickly. So what I would like to do is kind of establish 3 points on the scale that we can use as a rough frame of reference for this conversation. I'm going to call those 3 points free-for-all shopping, effort-required shopping, and hard-to-find shopping. Free-for-all shopping is pretty much what it sounds like, a shopping experience where players can get anything they want pretty much any time they want, and can sell pretty much anything they want very easily inside of the game. In this particular instance, a character can buy anything for the listed price, and if they want to sell something, they can sell it at 50% of the listed price, again pretty much at will. Free-for-all shopping largely ignores things like rarity, settlement level, or other issues that might play into whether or not a character could actually find the item that they're looking for, or find a reasonable buyer to sell an item to. Free-for-all shopping just kind of waves these issues away and says if a character wants to buy or sell, outside of very special circumstances, they're going to be able to do so. At the middle of the scale is the effort-required shopping that I mentioned earlier, And this follows what I think are the default assumptions of Pathfinder 2e that I mentioned just a moment ago. Characters can typically find any common item up to a maximum item level of either their character level or the settlement level, whichever happens to be lower. Uncommon items can potentially be found in the same range, though often with an additional surcharge, and if a character wants to find or sell items above a settlement's level, then there's going to be some kind of extra steps involved, such as making a special order or hunting down a particular buyer. Going past effort-required shopping is the hard-to-find version of shopping, which basically assumes there is almost no market whatsoever for any kind of magical item or high-level item inside of your game. If a character wants to buy runes for their sword, there's not going to be a shop that is going to sell that sort of thing. By the same token, if a character wants to sell their scroll of fireball, there are very few people who would be able to use that scroll, and it would be almost impossible to find a buyer. The hard-to-find variant very specifically limits the options and opportunities that PCs will have to buy things that they're looking for and to sell things that they have come across. Now, for the record, I think Paizo did a good thing by presenting the idea of shopping, of buying and selling, as a sliding scale. I think every story, every table is going to have different needs, and so having these different touch points of what buying and selling can look like really allows for game masters to approach this topic in a way that is beneficial to their stories. So before we dive into some of the nitty and gritty, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the different points on this scale. You can tell at a pretty quick glance that these different points on the scale all serve different types of stories. For example, a gritty survivalist story pretty much mandates that a character would consider trail rations hard to find, much less a greater striking longbow. If you really want to push a survivalist narrative for a portion of your story, making shops, making marketplaces hard to find is going to be part of presenting that narrative. But by the same token, a hard-to-find approach to magic items can also be very frustrating for players. I have played in games where the game master denied any kind of significant treasure for the first 10 levels of play, and I can tell you that for the players in that game, it was a pretty rough experience. It felt really frustrating to do all of these heroic things and to have all of these wonderful adventures, but at the end of the day, never be able to purchase a single magical sword. The hard-to-find scenario in certain circumstances feels more like you're punishing a player rather than developing the story. On the opposite extreme, you have the free-for-all, which can also have its problems. For any game master out there who has ever done a character sheet audit, you have probably run into a scenario where a character has somehow managed to hoard almost 70 healing potions over 15 levels of play. That is a real number from a character sheet audit I have done before. But if you think back to when we started the conversation about Downtime Mode in Pathfinder 2e, Downtime Mode exists primarily to progress the narrative. That's the reason for Downtime Mode play. It is a way to speed up what is happening and get back to those nail-biting dungeon crawls as quickly as possible. Sure, free-for-all buying and selling might break some of the immersion of your story, but it can also serve the pacing of your story and allow you to get back to some of the most important moments very quickly. I think that middle ground, the effort required version of the buying and selling that Pathfinder seems to use as the default assumption, I think that is a relatively safe starting place for a lot of game masters, and then you can adjust the different points around buying and selling to tailor to the needs of your game. But it is good to stop and realize that each of the 3 points on the scale that I have presented all have their own purpose and all serve different types of narratives, and so as a game master you want to ask, what is the narrative purpose of this buying and selling scenario, and how do I want to adjust the rules for this to best reflect that purpose? So now that we kind of have a scale to consider when it comes to buying and selling, the next thing we want to consider are the factors that might adjust that scale. And one thing that I want to say really quick is, as a game master, you want to be cognizant as you modify your approach to buying and selling, it is going to impact the choices that your characters make inside of the game. If you're running a very hard-to-find buying and selling experience where there are very few marketplaces and the goods that can be bought and sold are very limited, that is naturally going to make your players want to invest in skills like crafting or diplomacy in order to push what they are able to find or make. And I'm sure that pushing your players to invest more heavily in the crafting subsystem in Pathfinder 2e will not be controversial at all. By the same token, as you move towards the more free-for-all side of the scale, you will make options like crafting less interesting to your players, and they might be inclined to invest in other options inside the game. So storytellers, be aware that as you mess with this scale, your players are going to adjust their actions accordingly. But what are the factors that you as a storyteller want to consider in deciding where you want to land on this scale, from free-for-all shopping to effort-required shopping to the hard-to-find shopping? Well, first and foremost, I've said it several times, is story. What kind of story are you telling, and what kind of story are you telling at this moment inside of the game? You see, the place that you have on the scale and movements that you make to the scale can reinforce important parts of your story. Imagine that you start your campaign in the middle of a war zone. Your characters are trying to survive a bitter and bloody battle between two sides, and to reflect that difficult and dangerous situation, supplies are very hard to find. But then, after several levels worth of adventures and a lot of hard work, the battles are over, the war is won, and now markets are opening again, and maybe some effort is required, but now things are a lot more available. Or imagine that you want to focus your story on themes of wealth and excess, of a society grown so large and full of itself that it denies itself no end of interesting options. Well, a free-for-all could very easily tie into that kind of narrative. The first factor you want to consider is, what kind of story are you telling? Another factor that you can consider, and this is a really good one if you want to add some good role-playing opportunity to your stories, that is your player's relationship with the merchant in question. If characters do a favor for a particular merchant, or if they are repeat customers for a favorite seller inside of their hometown, that relationship that they build with the merchant can be both a fun role-playing opportunity and also a nice mechanical boon as a reward for that role-playing. Maybe after helping the merchant, they get about a 5% discount on a future purchase or purchases. Additionally, as a character's relationship with a merchant grows, they might find that the merchant is willing to offer them special products or is willing to do special favors to find products that are not normally available at their shop. Obviously, attempting to detail every single merchant that a player might encounter might be more work than you want to put in as a storyteller, but picking a few particular merchants and allowing your players to build a special relationship with them, that can make for a lot of fun role-playing. Another factor that you might use to adjust the process of buying and selling is buying and selling. This is basically a classic economics concept, supply and demand. What is the character buying? What is the character selling? And what kind of demand or market exists for those particular things? If characters travel to a wizard's college, then things like scrolls and tomes might be more readily available, while if the characters are selling off some excess healing potions at the war front, they might find some people who are willing to pay a little bit more than normal because honestly those items are in demand. You can see how the nature of the transaction could impact the story being told. And from this point, you start to deal with some of the other mechanical factors inside of the game. We've already mentioned at a few different points the concept of rarity. Common items inside of the game should be, in most circumstances, common. That's their purpose. It might take a little coin to acquire them, but finding them shouldn't be that hard. By the same token, uncommon, rare, and unique items should be correspondingly more difficult to locate and purchase because, well, there just aren't that many of them. As a storyteller, you want to consider about how the rarity of an item would impact the process of buying and selling, and also as a storyteller, you can manipulate the rarity of an item to change elements of the settlement or the story. If characters were to go shopping and discover that all of the healing potions in town have mysteriously been bought up in the last few days, that could easily add a lot of tension to your story. And these different levels of rarity tie in very neatly with another element we've mentioned throughout this video, which is the location where your characters are shopping and the level of the settlement where your characters happen to be. A backwater hamlet probably doesn't have the same shopping opportunities that Absalom, the city at the heart of the world, does. Now, as we mentioned in the Earn Income video, most settlement levels are going to cap out somewhere around 11 or 12, meaning that really high level items at level 14, 15, 16, all the way up to 20, these are almost always going to have some extra level of effort required to obtain the item, or possibly even a full investment into crafting in order for that item to become available to your players. There comes a point where the free market doesn't quite provide everything that your players might be looking for. But the settlement itself can be a powerful factor into what kind of story you want buying and selling to be. Now, for the last few points in this video, I want to cover a couple of things that you might want to consider as a storyteller. One is the snake oil salesman. Snake oil is actually an item that alchemists can make in Pathfinder 2e. It is low-key one of my favorite items in Pathfinder 2e. I think that was a hilarious inclusion. But one of the things as a storyteller that you want to think about is, what about the dishonest merchant? What about the merchant who is passing off fake goods or low-quality goods? That can be a really interesting storytelling beat, but as a storyteller, I would like to say, use this sparingly. If it happens occasionally, it can lead to a lot of engagement for your players, but if it happens constantly, your players could end up feeling punished or bitter and feel like you're working against them as a storyteller. So the snake oil approach can be a lot of fun, but I do recommend use it sparingly. But those are my thoughts on buying and selling, so let me turn the conversation over to you. What do you think about the process of shopping in Pathfinder 2e, and where does your table tend to fall? Are you more on the free-for-all side of the scale? Do you tend more towards gritty, hard-to-find shopping experiences? Or do you follow the Pathfinder default where some effort might be required? And what advice do you have to help make buying and selling a more interesting part of the story at your gaming table? Leave your thoughts in the comments section down below, and don't forget to do all of that YouTube stuff like liking the video, sharing it, and subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.